Inside the WNBA offices in New York, the mood changed quietly at first. There was no public announcement, no emergency press conference, no official statement that hinted something had gone wrong. But behind closed doors, conversations stopped sounding like strategy sessions and started sounding like crisis management. Phones rang more often. Meetings stretched longer. Emails that used to take days suddenly demanded answers within minutes. The league wasn't dealing with a scandal, a lawsuit, or a failed drug test. It was dealing with something far more dangerous, a loss of control. For nearly 3 decades, the WNBA survived by keeping expectations modest. Growth was steady but careful. Attention was welcomed, but only in manageable doses. The league learned how to operate without chaos, without excess, without a single figure becoming bigger than the system itself. That balance, fragile as it was, allowed the league to protect its culture, its hierarchy, and its internal order. But that balance didn't collapse because of controversy. It collapsed because of money. The moment that changed everything didn't happen on a basketball court. It didn't come during a finals game or a nationally televised matchup. It came in the form of a signature. A deal finalized quietly, efficiently, and with consequences no one inside the league was prepared to handle. A 22-year-old rookie, Caitlin Clark, signed a Nike contract so massive that it instantly shattered the financial reality the WNBA had operated under since its inception. Overnight, she became wealthier than entire rosters combined. Not because of league salaries. Not because of championships. But because the corporate world decided she was worth the risk. What made this moment unsettling wasn't just the size of the deal. It was the timing. Clark hadn't yet played a single professional minute when the rumors began circulating. She hadn't earned veteran status. She hadn't fought through years of obscurity. She hadn't paid the traditional dues that defined respect inside the league. And yet, she arrived with something no one else had ever possessed. Leverage that didn't come from the WNBA at all. At the center of this storm stood Kathy Engelbert, a commissioner who had spent years trying to stabilize a league built on resilience and restraint. Her job had never been to manage superstardom. It had been to protect a collective identity. But suddenly, she was forced into an impossible position. On one side stood the league's most profitable asset, a player driving ratings, merchandise sales, ticket demand, and media interest to historic levels. On the other side stood the veterans, the Olympians, the champions, and the legends who felt ignored, underpaid, and quietly displaced. This wasn't jealousy in the simplistic sense fans love to argue about online. This was structural tension. A system built on parity was being bent by a market that no longer cared about balance. Endorsement money doesn't follow seniority. It follows attention. And attention had chosen its new center. Inside locker rooms, the tone shifted. Conversations that once focused on rotations and scouting reports drifted toward money, visibility, and respect. Players who had spent a decade grinding for recognition watched a rookie bypass the entire struggle they had normalized as part of the job. 4 years, sacrifice was the currency of credibility in the WNBA. Playing overseas in the off-season. Flying commercial. Competing through injuries. Accepting limited exposure in exchange for pride. Clark represented the opposite reality. She arrived into sold-out arenas, national broadcasts, and corporate protection. The league had always marketed itself as a collective. No one bigger than the Shield. No one above the group. But this moment exposed a truth that had been quietly avoided for years. The WNBA was no longer a niche product. It was a growing entertainment business. And entertainment businesses do not reward fairness. They reward draw. What made the situation even more volatile was how quickly it escalated. There was no adjustment period. No slow integration of fame. The shift was instant. One contract redefined who mattered, who benefited, and who felt threatened. The air inside the league didn't just change. It thickened. Publicly, everything looked fine. Headlines framed the deal as progress. Growth. A win for women's basketball. But internally, the reaction was anything but unified. The Nike deal didn't just elevate Clark. It forced every other player, executive, and stakeholder to confront an uncomfortable reality. The league they helped build was no longer operating on the rules they understood. And once that realization set in, there was no going back. The number didn't sound real when it first circulated. Even people inside the league assumed it would be corrected, revised, or quietly walked back. Figures like that usually are. But this one didn't disappear. It hardened. It stuck. And the longer it stayed unchallenged, the more disruptive it became. $28 million. Not spread across a lifetime of endorsements. Not tied to vague incentives or performance clauses buried in fine print. A reported 8-year signature deal with Nike that instantly placed a rookie into a financial category the WNBA had never dealt with before. This wasn't just the largest deal in women's basketball. It was a psychological shock to a league built on controlled expectations. To understand why this mattered so deeply, you have to look at the numbers the league itself operates under. The maximum salary for a top WNBA player hovers around $200,000. Many veterans make far less. Even stars, even champions, even finals MVPs have spent years stacking overseas contracts just to reach financial stability. That grind wasn't a secret. It was accepted as part of the culture. The trade-off was pride, respect, and the belief that collective growth would eventually lift everyone. This deal broke that belief. Clark's rookie salary, roughly $76,000 in her first season, followed the same collectively bargained structure as every other rookie before her. On paper, nothing changed. But endorsement money doesn't respect paper agreements. It lives outside league control. It answers to market pull, not locker room hierarchy. And the market had spoken louder than ever. What made this especially destabilizing wasn't just that Clark got paid. It was when she got paid. Traditionally, even the most dominant players had to prove themselves professionally before major brands committed fully. Shoe deals came after championships, MVPs, Olympic runs. They were rewards for longevity and dominance. Clark skipped that entire sequence. She didn't climb the ladder. She appeared at the top of it. Inside the league, that timing mattered more than fans realized. Veterans didn't just see money. They saw a reordered status system. A hierarchy rewritten by clicks, ratings, and jersey sales rather than years of performance. It sent a message, intentional or not, that marketability now outweighed merit inside the business of basketball. Executives understood the logic immediately. Clark moved attention. She moved inventory. She moved television ratings in ways the league had never experienced. For sponsors, she was low risk and high return. But players don't experience economics as spreadsheets. They experience them as emotion. And emotionally, this felt like a bypass. Imagine working in the same company for 10 or 15 years. You show up early. You carry the workload. You represent the brand when no one is watching. Then one day, a new hire walks in and earns more in a year than you will in your entire career. You can rationalize it intellectually. You can understand why management made the decision. But that doesn't erase the feeling that the system no longer values your sacrifice. That feeling spread quickly. Locker rooms that once welcomed rookies as future contributors started treating Clark as an exception. Not because of her personality. Not because of her game. But because the deal placed her outside the shared experience that bonded players together. She didn't arrive through the same doors. She didn't need the same exits. She existed in a different financial reality from day one. The league office immediately recognized the danger. This wasn't just about envy. It was about cohesion. When one player becomes financially untouchable, every interaction around them changes. Fouls feel different. Trash talk carries more weight. Physical play stops being purely competitive and starts carrying symbolic meaning. And the problem for the WNBA was simple. They couldn't undo the deal. They didn't negotiate it. They didn't approve it. They couldn't cap it. Corporate money had entered the ecosystem without asking permission. The league was now forced to adapt to a reality it didn't design. For years, the WNBA had avoided building around a single commercial figure. Stars were promoted, but always within a collective framework. This deal shattered that approach. Clark wasn't just a player anymore. She was an economic force operating independently of league structures. And once that line was crossed, the system had to respond. Not everyone responded the same way. Some saw opportunity. Some saw betrayal. Some saw a future where they would finally be paid what they believed they were worth. Others saw a future where their relevance faded faster than their skill. The contract didn't just make Clark rich. It forced every other player to ask an uncomfortable question. What does my value look like in a league that now measures worth this way? And that question didn't stay theoretical for long. At first, most players said the right things publicly. They congratulated Clark. They talked about growth. They framed the moment as a win for the league. On camera, everything sounded supportive. But inside the locker rooms, the conversations felt very different. Respect in the WNBA has always been earned through time, pain, and persistence. That code didn't disappear overnight, but it was suddenly being tested in ways no one had experienced before. For years, the culture of the league was built on shared struggle. Players flew commercial and squeezed into middle seats after back-to-back games. They played overseas in the off-season, sometimes in countries they barely knew, just to supplement incomes that lagged far behind their male counterparts. Injuries were played through, not because it was smart, but because there was no safety net. That grind became part of the league's identity. It wasn't just basketball. It was survival. Clark's arrival disrupted that narrative instantly. She didn't come in carrying the same scars. She didn't need to chase contracts abroad. She didn't have to worry about whether the league could support her long-term. Her financial security was already locked in. And while none of that was her fault, it created an invisible distance between her and the players who had lived a very different reality. Veterans didn't feel replaced. They felt skipped. That distinction matters. This wasn't about fear that Clark would take their minutes or their roster spots. It was about the feeling that the league had jumped ahead in line and crowned someone before the rest of the room finished speaking. For players who had spent years being told to wait their turn, the speed of Clark's ascent felt like a violation of the unspoken rules. The resentment didn't stem from her three-point shooting or her stat lines. It stemmed from symbolism. Clark became the face of a future the veterans believed they had earned but would never fully benefit from. Her success shined a light on how long they had waited for the same recognition. And when that light turns on suddenly, it doesn't always feel like warmth. Sometimes it feels like exposure. There was also a generational gap that made things worse. Older players had grown accustomed to a league that moved slowly, where recognition came incrementally and rarely. Younger players, raised in the social media era, understood how quickly attention could snowball. Clark straddled both worlds. She had the discipline of a traditional player but the reach of a modern celebrity. That combination made her difficult to categorize and even harder to relate to. The problem wasn't just jealousy. It was legitimacy. In the WNBA, legitimacy is built over seasons, not headlines. Veterans had proven themselves in finals, Olympic runs, and years of professional dominance. They had been overlooked, underpaid, and often ignored by mainstream sports media. To watch a rookie receive immediate validation from the corporate world felt like a rewriting of the values they were taught to uphold. This emotional friction showed up in subtle ways first. Body language, tone in interviews, less patience on the court, harder screens, sharper words. The game didn't suddenly become violent, but it became colder. Clark wasn't treated like a newcomer learning the ropes. She was treated like a symbol that needed to be tested. There is a difference between welcoming a star and challenging one. In this case, the challenge wasn't about basketball dominance. It was about proving that money couldn't buy acceptance. That no matter how many commercials ran or jerseys sold, respect inside the league still had to be fought for possession by possession. The league office was watching this closely. They knew that resentment left unchecked doesn't stay quiet. It escalates. In professional sports, frustration rarely expresses itself in meetings or statements. It expresses itself physically. Fouls become harder. Contact becomes more personal. Plays stop looking like competition and start looking like messages. Clark, whether she wanted to be or not, became the message board. Every time she stepped on the court, she represented more than a rookie. She represented a system shift. And systems under pressure don't break cleanly. They crack. They splinter. They push back. By the time the season gained momentum, the tone was no longer subtle. The question inside locker rooms wasn't whether Clark deserved success. It was whether the league had handled her rise in a way that respected the people who built it. And once that question took hold, the game itself began to change. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in possession by possession, contact by contact, moment by moment. On paper, the game still looked normal. Box scores didn't scream chaos. But anyone watching closely could feel it. The way defenders closed space on Clark was different. The way bodies collided carried extra force. Fouls lingered a second longer than necessary. What used to be standard physicality started to feel personal. In every league, stars are tested. Rookies are challenged. That's not unusual. What made this different was the intent behind the contact. It wasn't about stopping a shot or disrupting a play. It was about establishing a boundary. A reminder that endorsement money doesn't soften the floor or protect you from pain. The message was clear. You may be rich, you may be famous, but you still have to survive this league. Players guarding Clark weren't just defending a scorer. They were defending a culture. Every hard bump became a statement. Every aggressive closeout felt like an argument. This wasn't coordinated. It didn't need to be. When resentment exists collectively, it expresses itself instinctively. One player pushes the limit, another sees it, and the standard shifts. The league office noticed. Officials noticed. Fans noticed. What started as "welcome to the league" energy began drawing scrutiny because it crossed into something else. Plays that had nothing to do with basketball outcomes started appearing. Contact away from the ball. Hits on inbounds. Moments where the objective wasn't defense, but disruption. For Clark, this created an impossible environment. If she complained, she risked being labeled soft or entitled. If she stayed quiet, the physicality escalated. Every response carried consequences. That's the trap of becoming the face of something bigger than yourself. You lose the ability to exist neutrally. Everything you do is interpreted as a stance. What complicated matters further was how this played on television. Clips circulated quickly. Slow-motion replays highlighted collisions. Commentators debated whether the league was protecting its stars or letting the game stay real. Online discourse spiraled. Some fans framed the hits as proof that the WNBA was tough. Others saw something darker, something unnecessary. Inside the league, the concern wasn't debate. It was liability. Basketball is physical by nature, but there is a difference between toughness and risk. When a player becomes a focal point for aggression, the probability of injury increases. And when that player is the most commercially valuable asset the league has ever had, every fall becomes a potential disaster. The irony was uncomfortable. The same deal that elevated Clark's status also made her more vulnerable. Her presence raised the stakes of every interaction. A twisted ankle or a concussion wouldn't just impact a team. It would impact broadcast schedules, sponsor confidence, and the league's long-term momentum. Players felt this tension too. Some pulled back. Others leaned into it. Once physicality becomes symbolic, it stops being about basketball IQ and starts becoming emotional release. That's when control slips. That's when a league risks watching its product turn from competition into confrontation. Clark didn't provoke this shift. But she stood at the center of it. Every night, she absorbed contact that carried years of frustration behind it. Years of being overlooked. Years of being told to wait. Years of promises that growth was coming. And then, in one moment, one play made it impossible to pretend this was just basketball anymore. That was the moment the league realized it wasn't dealing with competitive edge. It was dealing with a narrative spiral it might not be able to contain. There are plays that define games, and then there are plays that define eras. This wasn't a scoring run or a buzzer beater. It didn't alter the standings. But it changed the conversation instantly and permanently. When Clark took a blindside hip check on an inbound pass, the reaction across the league was immediate. Not because it was a hard foul. Hard fouls happen. But because it had nothing to do with basketball. The ball wasn't in play. There was no defensive objective. No attempt to disrupt a scoring action. It was pure impact, delivered with intent, and everyone watching understood the difference. In slow motion, the play looked even worse. The contact was deliberate. The timing was calculated. And when the camera cut to the bench, the real damage revealed itself. They cheered. That response sent shockwaves through the league office. It wasn't the foul itself that triggered panic. It was the approval of it. When a bench applauds a non-basketball hit, it signals something far more dangerous than physical play. It signals that the code has broken. That players are no longer policing each other internally. That retaliation and message sending have become acceptable currency. From that moment on, the situation escalated beyond player behavior. This became a public relations nightmare. Clips replayed endlessly across sports networks. Analysts debated whether Clark was being targeted. Social media exploded with accusations, defenses, and cultural commentary. The narrative spun out of the league's hands in real time. For a league trying to attract long-term corporate partners, this was catastrophic. Sponsors don't invest in chaos. They invest in stability, predictability, and brand safety. They want highlight reels, not controversy breakdowns. The headlines shifted away from performance and toward conflict. And that shift triggered alarms at the highest levels. Emergency meetings were called. Not to discipline a single player, but to address a pattern. The league wasn't just protecting Clark. It was protecting its image. The question on the table wasn't whether the foul was legal. It was whether the WNBA was allowing its most visible product to be associated with bullying narratives. Executives understood the optics immediately. A young, white, highly marketable rookie taking repeated physical punishment from veteran players carried implications far beyond basketball. It invited cultural interpretation, political framing, media distortion. Every angle made the situation harder to control. The league had to act quickly, but carefully. Overreacting would inflame players who already felt disrespected. Underreacting would signal tolerance. Neither option was clean. The message had to be firm without appearing protective. That balance is nearly impossible to strike once a controversy reaches national attention. Behind closed doors, teams were reminded of expectations. Officials were given guidance. The tone shifted. Hard fouls didn't disappear, but the threshold for punishment changed. Fines were issued retroactively. Flagrant calls increased. The league was attempting to regain authority without admitting it had lost it. For players, this felt like surveillance. For fans, it felt overdue. For Clark, it was another adjustment she never asked for. She didn't request special treatment. But the reality was undeniable. When one player's injury risk threatens the league's financial future, neutrality disappears. The incident also fractured trust internally. Veterans who already believed the league favored Clark now saw evidence, in their minds, that the system would bend to protect her. That belief deepened resentment, even as it reduced visible aggression. The conflict didn't end. It went underground. What the league didn't say publicly was what truly scared them. If one more incident crossed the line, if a brawl broke out, if Clark suffered a serious injury in a moment that looked intentional, the damage wouldn't be reparable with statements or suspensions. It would redefine the league in the worst possible way. The hip check wasn't just a foul. It was a warning shot. And it forced the WNBA into a posture it had never needed before. Crisis containment. For more than a decade, charter flights had been one of the most bitter unresolved issues inside the WNBA. Players asked for them repeatedly. Not as a luxury, but as a matter of health, recovery, and basic professional dignity. Back-to-back games, late-night travel, cramped commercial seats, and delayed connections weren't just inconveniences. They shortened careers. They increased injury risk. They drained bodies that were already being pushed to the limit. Every time the topic surfaced, the response from the league was consistent. We can't afford it. The numbers don't work. The business isn't there yet. It became a familiar refrain, and eventually, players stopped expecting a different answer. Charter flights turned into a symbol of everything the league said it wanted to be, but couldn't yet support. Then Clark arrived. Almost immediately, her presence created a new problem the league had never faced before. Security. Fans weren't just attending games. They were tracking flights. They were gathering in terminals. They were crowding baggage claims. What used to be a quiet arrival suddenly looked like a public safety concern. The risk wasn't theoretical. It was visible. And it was growing. Within months, the league announced a $25 million investment to roll out charter flights for all teams. On the surface, this looked like a breakthrough. A long-awaited win for players. A sign of progress. A tangible improvement to working conditions that athletes had begged for over years of negotiations. But inside the locker rooms, the reaction was anything but celebratory. Timing is everything in labor politics. And this timing was disastrous. From the veterans' perspective, the message felt unmistakable. We asked for this for 10 years. We were told no every time. Then one rookie becomes a security risk, and suddenly the money appears. It didn't matter that the flights applied to everyone. It didn't matter that the league framed it as a growth investment. The perception was already locked in. This wasn't about player welfare. This was about protecting one asset. That belief spread quickly. Conversations shifted from gratitude to suspicion. Why now? Why this fast? Why did safety only become a priority once Clark entered the picture? For players who had endured years of discomfort, the rollout felt less like progress and more like favoritism finally being acknowledged. The league tried to control the narrative. Officials emphasized that this decision was years in the making. That revenue growth had finally made it possible. That Clark's popularity merely accelerated an inevitable change. But explanations don't erase emotional memory. Players remembered every no, every dismissed proposal, every off-season meeting where their concerns were deemed unrealistic. The charter flights also created an awkward dynamic within teams. On paper, everyone benefited. In practice, resentment lingered. Some players saw the flights as a reminder that their needs only mattered when tied to marketability. Others quietly accepted the upgrade but resented the reason it arrived. What should have been a unifying improvement became another fault line. From a business standpoint, the league's decision made sense. The risk of a high-profile incident involving Clark in a public airport was too high. One viral moment could undo years of brand building. Charter flights were cheaper than damage control. Executives understood that calculation immediately. But players don't experience policy decisions as spreadsheets. They experience them as validation or dismissal. And for many veterans, this felt like confirmation that the league's priorities had shifted permanently. The flights became symbolic. Not of growth, but of who drives decisions now. The comfort that players finally received carried an uncomfortable truth alongside it. Without Clark, it might not have happened at all. That realization deepened the divide. It reinforced the belief that the league had entered a new phase where individual star power could override collective bargaining history. And once that belief takes root, trust erodes quickly. The commissioner now had to navigate a delicate reality. A decision meant to stabilize the league had inflamed tensions instead. Publicly, the WNBA looked more professional than ever. Privately, the sense of imbalance grew stronger. And just as the league hoped the situation might settle, another decision landed that reignited everything. The Olympic roster. When the Team USA roster for the Paris Olympics was released, one name dominated the conversation by not being there. USA Basketball had finalized its list, and despite being the most talked-about player in the sport, Caitlin Clark was left off. Officially, the explanation was simple. Experience. Chemistry. Continuity. The Olympic team, they argued, isn't a development program. It's a precision machine built over years, and rookies don't just walk into it. From a purely technical basketball standpoint, that argument wasn't absurd. The roster was stacked with veterans who had won together before. Players who understood the system. Players who had earned trust over multiple cycles. If the Olympics were judged only on X's and O's, the decision could be defended. But the Olympics are never just about basketball. They are about visibility, narrative, global reach, and business. And in those categories, the decision was catastrophic. NBC had quietly prepared for a Caitlin Clark Olympics. Jerseys were ready. Marketing concepts were aligned. Broadcast storylines were built around introducing her to a worldwide audience. For casual viewers who don't follow the WNBA closely, Clark was the entry point. She was the hook. Leaving her off the roster didn't just remove a player. It removed momentum. Inside the league office, the frustration was real, even if it was never voiced publicly. The commissioner had no authority over the Olympic Selection Committee, but the consequences would land squarely on the WNBA. A once-every-4 years opportunity to convert global attention into long-term fans vanished overnight. And worse, the explanation didn't satisfy anyone outside the league. To many fans, the snub looked like gatekeeping. A message from the old guard that said, "We built this without you, and we don't need you now." The decision felt less like strategy and more like protection of legacy. A way to ensure that the Olympic spotlight stayed fixed on familiar faces, rather than the rookie threatening to dominate every conversation. That perception ignited conspiracy theories immediately. Some believed there was a coordinated effort to humble Clark. Others saw it as retaliation for the endorsement deal. A reminder that no amount of money could bypass institutional power. Whether true or not, the theories gained traction because the league had already lost narrative control. Ironically, the snub made Clark even more powerful. While the Olympic team competed, the conversation didn't center on gold medals or box scores. It centered on absence. Every broadcast, every panel, every social media thread eventually circled back to the same question. Why wasn't she there? Merchandise sales surged. Her name stayed in headlines without her playing a single minute. The Olympic spotlight turned into a Clark amplifier instead of a substitute. For veterans, this was a complicated moment. On one hand, they protected their space. On the other, they unintentionally elevated the very player they were accused of sidelining them for. The move that was meant to preserve hierarchy ended up strengthening the narrative that Clark existed outside the system altogether. The league watched this unfold with unease. The Olympics were supposed to stabilize the season's chaos. Instead, they added another layer of division. Fans who supported Clark felt dismissed. Fans loyal to the veterans felt attacked. Media coverage grew sharper, less charitable, more polarized. What the snub ultimately exposed was a widening disconnect between basketball logic and business reality. The people making decisions were still operating under old assumptions about how growth happens. The market had already moved on. By the time the Olympic cycle ended, one thing was clear. Clark didn't need Team USA to expand her reach. And that realization forced the league to confront an uncomfortable truth. Institutional power no longer guaranteed control. And beneath all of this, a deeper tension was forming. One that went beyond contracts, rosters, or flights. A cultural divide that the league had never fully prepared to manage. By the time the season reached its midpoint, the conversation around Caitlin Clark had drifted far beyond basketball. It wasn't just about points, efficiency, or wins anymore. It was about identity. About who the league was for, who it had always been for, and who it might become next. And that shift exposed a fault line that had existed quietly for years but had never been this visible. The rivalry narratives poured in fast. Clark on one side. Angel Reese on the other. Two young stars with very different styles, backgrounds, and public perceptions became symbolic stand-ins for something much larger than competition. Media outlets framed it as entertainment. Fans treated it like a culture war. And the league found itself trapped in the middle. Clark was embraced by a demographic that historically hadn't paid much attention to the WNBA. Middle America. Casual sports fans. Viewers who didn't know the league's history but knew her logo threes and college highlights. Reese, meanwhile, represented the swagger, edge, and unapologetic confidence that had defined the league's culture for decades. Her game, her attitude, her visibility spoke directly to the players and fans who had been there long before the spotlight arrived. Instead of letting that contrast exist naturally, the internet forced it into opposition. Every hard foul became a referendum. Every celebration became a headline. When Clark took contact, one side screamed targeting. When Reese talked trash, another side screamed disrespect. Nuance vanished. Everything was flattened into sides. The league tried to steer the narrative toward healthy rivalry. They invoked comparisons to Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. Competitive, contrasting, but mutually elevating. But the comparison didn't hold. Magic and Bird entered a league already accustomed to national attention. The WNBA was still adjusting to it. And sudden exposure magnified every misstep. What made this especially dangerous was how quickly the conversation slipped into racial undertones. Not always explicit, often implied. Questions about marketability surfaced. Why did one player get the historic endorsement immediately? Was it just shooting range? Or was it presentation? Audience appeal? Geography? These weren't questions asked on official broadcasts, but they were being asked loudly in comment sections and locker rooms. The league understood the risk. Once fan discourse turns toxic, sponsors get nervous. Players feel unprotected. Statements condemning harassment and abuse were released. Social media policies were reiterated. But moderation doesn't erase momentum. The league had helped create a spectacle it could no longer fully manage. Former players added fuel, sometimes unintentionally. Cheryl Swoops faced backlash after making comments that appeared to diminish Clark's achievements, including spreading inaccurate claims about her age and competition level. Whether driven by frustration or misunderstanding, the effect was the same. When legends questioned the legitimacy of the new star, it validated the idea that resentment ran deeper than rivalry. For fans new to the league, these moments were confusing. They expected celebration. Instead, they saw resistance. For longtime fans, the attention felt intrusive. They saw the league being reshaped by audiences who hadn't shared the years of struggle. Both perspectives felt justified. And that mutual defensiveness made compromise nearly impossible. The commissioner now faced a challenge far more complex than contracts or travel logistics. She had to manage perception across communities that didn't speak the same language. One group saw growth and opportunity. Another saw erasure and disrespect. Both believed they were protecting the league. The most unsettling part was that none of this centered on Clark's behavior. She didn't trash talk excessively. She didn't demand special treatment publicly. She didn't provoke controversy intentionally. And yet, she became the lightning rod for every unresolved tension the league carried into this new era. The cultural fault line wasn't created by her success. It was exposed by it. And just as the league struggled to contain the narrative, another issue surfaced that threatened to push everything over the edge. Control of the game itself. Officiating is where leagues quietly enforce their values. Not through press releases or interviews, but through whistles, no calls, and the invisible lines that determine what is acceptable on the floor. For years, the WNBA prided itself on toughness. Physical play was part of its identity. Rookies didn't get star treatment. Veterans earned respect through contact. That standard wasn't controversial. It was expected. But Caitlin Clark changed how that standard was interpreted. Night after night, viewers noticed the same pattern. Clark absorbed contact that would have drawn whistles elsewhere. Hands checked her off the ball. Bodies collided mid-air. Hits came late, sometimes high, sometimes unnecessary. Analysts debated it cautiously. Was this just playoff-level physicality arriving early? Or was something else happening? Inside league circles, the explanation was simple and dangerous. Let the rookie feel it. Make sure she understands how hard this league is. There's logic to that thinking. The NBA has done it for decades. Stars earn calls over time. Respect comes with survival. But the scale of the attention surrounding Clark made that approach risky in ways the league hadn't fully considered. Every no-call now lived forever online. Fans clipped plays frame by frame. Comparisons spread. Accusations followed. Some believed the league was intentionally allowing extra physicality to humble Clark, to protect veteran legitimacy, to avoid making the WNBA look weak. Others argued the opposite. claiming officials were hesitant to protect her out of fear of favoritism backlash. Whether any directive existed didn't matter. Perception had already taken over. The danger wasn't competitive imbalance. It was escalation. When players sense that whistles won't come, they push further. Contact intensifies. Angles sharpen. And once officials lose authority, chaos isn't far behind. One shove becomes two. One missed call invites retaliation. A brawl stops being hypothetical. Executives understood what was at stake. A fight involving the face of the league wouldn't just dominate sports news. It would reach sponsors. Corporate partners like State Farm and Gatorade don't invest in uncertainty. They invest in controlled environments where stars are protected enough to perform but challenged enough to remain credible. That balance had started to tip. Quiet adjustments followed. Mid-season, the tone changed. Officials called more flagrant fouls. Retroactive fines increased. The league began signaling that the line had been crossed. This wasn't about coddling a star. It was about preventing a public collapse of authority. Players noticed. Some bristled. Others adapted. The game slowed slightly. Contact became more calculated. But resentment didn't vanish. It simply lost its most visible outlet. What made this moment especially fragile was that it forced the league to confront a contradiction. The WNBA wanted to showcase toughness while also marketing superstars. It wanted parity without suppressing stardom. It wanted growth without cultural fracture. Those goals can coexist, but only with careful governance. Clark's presence compressed the timeline. There was no room for trial and error. Every adjustment felt reactive. Every mistake felt amplified. And every whistle, or lack of one, carried symbolic weight far beyond the play itself. The league had stabilized the surface. But underneath, the tension remained unresolved. And just when it seemed like the season might settle into a fragile equilibrium, a truth emerged that complicated everything. The money. Not endorsement money. League money. The kind that changes power dynamics permanently. Here is the part that made the resentment impossible to resolve with emotion alone. Caitlin Clark wasn't just changing attention. She was changing revenue. And revenue has a way of silencing arguments that pride cannot. Since her arrival, the league's financial indicators shifted rapidly. Games featuring the Indiana Fever were moved to larger arenas. Ticket prices that once hovered around $20 surged into the hundreds. Television ratings spiked, not just for her games, but for matchups that benefited indirectly from the curiosity she generated. Fans who tuned in for Clark stayed to learn the rest of the league. That ripple effect mattered. Behind the scenes, media rights negotiations took on a different tone. Before this surge, the WNBA was often described as breaking even at best, operating more on long-term belief than immediate profitability. Now, discussions began circulating about a new broadcast package that could reach numbers previously unthinkable for women's professional basketball. Reports suggested a potential valuation approaching $2.2 billion. Billion with a B. That number reframed everything. For veterans who had spent years grinding under financial ceilings, this was both vindication and insult. Vindication because they were finally being proven right about the league's potential. Insult because it took a rookie to unlock it. The uncomfortable truth was that Clark's presence accelerated timelines that might otherwise have taken another decade. This created a psychological contradiction. Players wanted the money. They needed the money. They had earned the money. But accepting it meant acknowledging the source of the acceleration. That acknowledgement was painful. It required setting aside years of resentment and admitting that the league now depended on someone who hadn't shared the same journey. Commissioner Engelbert understood this better than anyone. Her role quietly shifted from executive to mediator. She wasn't just negotiating media deals. She was negotiating egos. Her message to players became increasingly consistent, even if it wasn't always popular. Growth doesn't arrive evenly. Someone always triggers it. The choice was simple: resist the moment or capitalize on it. The next collective bargaining agreement loomed over everything. With new revenue on the table, salary caps could rise dramatically. Benefits could expand. career sustainability could finally improve. But those gains required unity. And unity required accepting a new power structure. That was the bitter pill. Clark didn't take money out of anyone's pocket. She put more into the system. But emotionally, it felt backwards. The veterans wanted to be the reason the league succeeded. Instead, they were being asked to share the credit with someone who arrived at the perfect moment. This is where economics clashed with identity. The WNBA had always marketed itself as a community, a shared fight. But professional sports are ultimately driven by markets, not morals. And markets had chosen a catalyst. What made this especially difficult was that Clark never asked to be that catalyst. She didn't lobby for rule changes. She didn't demand structural reform. She simply existed in a moment where the sport was ready, the audience was waiting, and the business world finally paid attention. The veterans faced a choice that had nothing to do with basketball skill. Accept the reality and benefit from it, or reject it and risk stalling the very growth they had spent years demanding. Neither option felt fair. But fairness was no longer the governing principle. Money had entered the conversation decisively. And once that happens, nostalgia stops being a strategy. The WNBA is no longer standing at the edge of change. It has already crossed it. What happened this season wasn't a temporary spike in attention or a viral moment that will fade with time. It was a structural shift that exposed everything the league had been balancing quietly for years. Power, money, identity, control. None of those conversations can be put back in the box now. Caitlin Clark didn't break the system on her own. She revealed its limits. Her Nike deal, the physical play, the charter flight backlash, the Olympic snub, the officiating debates, and the cultural divide weren't isolated incidents. They were pressure points. Stress fractures in a league that suddenly found itself growing faster than its traditions could adapt. For decades, the WNBA survived by being tight-knit and cautious. That approach protected it during lean years. But the same instincts now threaten to hold it back. The league can't market superstardom while punishing it. It can't invite global attention while clinging to gatekeeping. And it can't demand growth while resisting the discomfort that comes with it. The hardest truth for veterans to accept isn't that Clark arrived with advantages. It's that her presence accelerated outcomes they had been promised for years. Higher salaries, better travel, bigger media deals. Those changes are coming because the league finally has leverage. And that leverage has a face. At the same time, the league must recognize its responsibility. Protecting stars doesn't mean erasing toughness. Promoting growth doesn't mean abandoning culture. The future depends on balance. If the WNBA allows resentment to turn into targeting, or officiating to turn into chaos, the momentum will collapse under its own weight. One serious injury, one brawl, one sponsor pulling out. That's all it would take. This is why the commissioner's job has become nearly impossible. She isn't managing a season. She's managing a transformation. Every decision now sets precedent. Every misstep is amplified. And every week without clarity deepens the divide. The next 2 to 3 years will define the league's identity for a generation. Either the WNBA evolves into a global entertainment powerhouse that embraces its stars and multiplies opportunity across the board, or it fractures under the weight of its own contradictions. There is no middle ground left. Caitlin Clark didn't just sign a shoe deal. She signed a declaration that the quiet days are over. The spotlight isn't leaving. The money isn't shrinking. And the world isn't looking away. What happens next will depend on whether the league chooses unity over pride, growth over comfort, and vision over resentment. The war for the soul of the WNBA isn't theoretical anymore. It's happening live, every night, in front of millions. If you want deep, honest breakdowns like this, where money, power, and basketball collide, this channel is building that conversation from the ground up. Subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives as this story continues to evolve. Like this video to help push it into YouTube's algorithm and reach more fans. Comment below with your perspective. Do you think the league handled this right, or did they lose control? Your engagement directly supports this channel while it's growing, and it helps decide which stories get covered next. The next chapter of the WNBA is being written right now. And we'll be here to break it down, every step of the way.